Hello, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. I am here, I'm Ayyā Somā, and tonight the talk I think was advertised with myself, and then I had two more rebirths joining me here. So I have Giancarlo here to my right and Bante Sudazo here to my left. So we'll do a little bit of a different format tonight and explore the topic. Together with all the three venerables. So we picked the sutta actually for this purpose, and maybe I'll actually look it up so I can share it with you because we currently have the paper copy. If you actually have a copy of the Sutta Nipata from Venerable, translated by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, you can go on page 257 and you can find the Salla Sutta, the Dart. But I think there is another translation, not from Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, but from Kantipalo on Sutta Central, and I'll find the link for you all. But before we start, Giancarlo will be leading us in guided meditation on contemplation of death. So Giancarlo, if you'd like to lead us.
So we can all sit and close our eyes. Try to keep the upper body erect. You want to have your spine, each vertebrae, as if stacked one on top of the next, just fully upright. And then the skull just balanced on top. Set the body in this upright but relaxed posture. You can bring your attention to the breath, noting every in-breath and every out-breath. Our sutta discussion this evening will be about mindfulness of death. And with this meditation, you can just, as you're paying attention to the breath, just keep it in the back of your mind that we've only got so many more of these breaths left. There's a finite number of breaths that we'll have in our life before we die. And so we want to be awake and present with as many of them as we can. And it is possible to have a beautiful relationship with the breath. Intimately knowing every in-breath, intimately knowing every out-breath. Fully sensitive to every sensation related to the breath. Whether you want to keep your attention just at the tip of the nose, or in the chest, or in the abdomen, or if you want to pay attention in a more global way, feeling what they call the breath energy throughout the whole body. Just being fully present with this. this breath of our life. Before we get into any of the complicated or even for some disturbing aspects of death meditation for some, we can just keep this breath meditation very simple. Just focusing on appreciation. We are still alive. We do still have this breath and this breath. And the friendlier you are with your own breath, then to some extent, the friendlier the breath can be with you. In the beginning, the middle, and the end of every breath. You really can know every in-breath and every out-breath as if it was a whole life. The birth of the breath, the persistence of the breath, and the breath passing away. And living every breath as if it was a whole life. How do you want to experience this life? If your mind is settling, you just become more and more sensitive to the breath, more and more sensitive to the nuances, subtle feelings. And the more subtle your awareness, the more settled the mind can become. This is our life. It's extremely precious. And if your mind is not settling, if your thoughts are whirling, if your body's agitated, you can know that too. You can have clarity and acceptance with the breath, even if it's not how you want it. is born. The breath persists, and the breath passes away. And each and every breath, when it passes away, is totally gone. You'll never have that breath again. But every breath we take is conditioned by all of our previous breaths. And they go to condition our next breath. Try to live with and be with this very breath, this in-breath, and this out-breath, as if it was your last. As we shift from focus on the breath to a more engaged awareness, if you want to shift to listening mode, and just maybe take a few more breaths with gratitude. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes, and I will continue this investigation of life and death through Sutta studies. And anyone who wants is fully welcome to continue meditating as we talk.
Thank you, Rajan, for guiding us in meditation. And I'll briefly look for the sutta that is this one. So I can send it to our friends. Yes. All right. So here is the sutta we will be reading from. And welcome to quite a few friends. Hello, Gita, Chittapala, Kumu, Joy, Roy, Elaine, Charles, Melinda, good to see you. Putrika from Sri Lanka, great. Rick, Gorgel, Suzanne, long time no see. And Upan, welcome to everyone. And I'll put this in the Pali for Bhaktisiddhasa so he can check it out. Although I don't know if, yes, here it is. There you go. All right, so we will be reading from the translation of Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. So it will be slightly different from the one that you have here, that is from Kantipalo, so different from the Sutta Central version. Oops. All right, can you see Bhante? Great. All right, so I'll start by reading a few verses and then we can all discuss it together, if that sounds all right with the Venerables. This is an experiment tonight, so we haven't done it before to have a live stream with three Venerables talking about the same thing. So we'll see. So the sutta, actually we can start by paying homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. All right, so the sutta begins. Without a sign, unknown is the life of mortals here. It is difficult and short, and conjoined with suffering. For there is no way by which those who have been born will not die. Death occurs also when one has reached old age, for such is the nature of living beings. Just as when fruits have ripened, there is always fear of their falling. So for mortals who have taken birth, there is always fear of death. John Coppola, would you like to share some thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, it's kind of depressing. I mean, these first three stanzas, and actually even, it's going to be depressing for quite a bit more, actually. Yeah, especially the Kanti Palo reading, which is, here's the life of mortals, wretched and brief. That's the first two lines, and that's Bhikkhu Bodhi's is a bit more palatable. It's difficult and short, but yeah, I mean, the Buddha is kind of not. He's kind of like taking his gloves off. You know, he's not pulling his punches, and yeah, really just laying things out as it is. Did either of you look at the commentary to this as to what the story was behind this?
I never look at the commentary.
Yeah,
Neither do I.
With this, sometimes I do actually with this version of Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, because they're very good translations, and yeah, I do find, especially with the Sutta Nipata discourses, like, you know, it's hard to say, you know, what's actually going on with the commentary, but just to have some kind of idea. I mean, it's pretty very, very strong language, and you know, what type of person is ready to hear this? What do you guys think about that? Do you think, in your experience, do you think most people are ready to hear this even?
I was ready.
Yeah.
Please,
well, actually, what comes to mind is when the Buddha's laying out the gradual teaching, Anupubing Katang, as Bhante Sumedho was going through. This would fit under the category of dukkha, which the Buddha gets to actually more than halfway through. So he starts off with talking about generosity and morality and heaven realms, and then he talks about the dangers of sensual desires and the benefits of renunciation. And then when the person's mind is ready, then he would talk about dukkha. So I think that something like this is like talking about the dangers of samsara, so talking about death and so on. That's something to do when somebody's mind is already at a certain point. But realistically, there's also a lot of people who come to Buddhism because they have some deep experience of dukkha. So before they even have any understanding of anything about the Dhamma, they have some deep experience of the misery of existence. And usually one of two results comes from that. One is bitter cynicism, and the other possible result is Buddhist practice. So actually many people, this is their entry point. They have some deep experience of dukkha, and they want to find some answers, and it leads them to Buddhist practice. So actually I think there's nothing wrong with just launching directly into talking about dukkha, because for some people this is really going to hit home.
Yeah, well, to me, once again, I actually wished I had encountered this sutta when I was 10 years old. So I was definitely ready to hear this Dhamma when, well, I first heard it, but I wished I had heard it ahead of time. So when I was 10, it was actually when my grandfather died, and it made a huge impact in my mind. And um, even though I was very young, I started actually, I guess, creating the conditions for then start a spiritual path several decades later, but well, not several, a few. But yeah, like I'm also just a few days ago, I was thinking exactly this verse. Um, it is difficult. Unknown is the life of mortals here. It is difficult. Not the short part, actually. Sometimes when I have these thoughts or this experience of suffering, actually the life seems too long. So I remember prior to prior to Buddhism, there was a bit of a consolation in the idea that death would soon come. But then once rebirth was presented to me, that was really bad news. I was like, wow, you die and then you're reborn again. You have to do this all over again. This is so awful. So the difficult part, yes. The short, I don't know about, but conjoined with suffering, absolutely. So difficult and conjoined with suffering, very much so. Very, very relevant. And also, I think there is some sort of consolation in hearing that this experience is not unique to only one being. When I was definitely an adolescent, there was this sense of kind of just being the only person that was going through suffering. And sometimes, even as an adult, there is that sense I'm the only one experiencing this suffering. But actually realizing that this is part of the human condition, there is already a consolation in that, I would say. Being part of, that there is no difference between the three of us and the five of the other people here at the monastery, and the thousands of people in West Orange, New Jersey, and millions of people and billions of people everywhere. So the condition of sentient beings. So there's comfort in that, and also like a sense of urgency, I would say, when it comes to rebirth. So when, yeah, the idea that is the nature of living beings, it really speaks to me. It's also interesting death occurs also when one has reached old age. So specifying even, what perhaps a lot of people look forward to, a long life, even when it's not short, but still we'll all have to face death in one shape or form. And I also like the simile, just as when fruits have ripened, there is always a fear of their falling. Um, it's kind of, I was thinking about tomatoes when we used to have tomato plants in the, at the other center in Rockaway Beach. And yeah, there were so many tomatoes, and they were all always about to fall. And there's kind of like that anxiety that you're wasting food. So in here, it's kind of like this, we're wasting our time here. So it creates that sense of urgency, but also that sense of fear, the fear of death.
I mean, one thing that I do really appreciate here is that the Buddha is also emphasizing that that death is completely natural. So it's inevitable, but it's completely natural. He's like, everything that is born eventually dies. This is just the nature of living beings. So that also calls to mind. It's like, well, why are we making such a big deal out of something that's perfectly normal? Like we act like it's such a disaster when people die, but actually there's nothing disastrous. It's just the way nature works.
It's interesting, like this sutta in context of the Buddha's teachings. I mean, we haven't really gotten to the punchline yet, which is basically, the Buddha didn't just describe how nature is. Like he, prescribed. There's a prescription. He's got like a path of practice. Like there's something you can do about this.
Mm-hmm.
Like the reason why, this, the Buddhist teachings in general, but this discourse in particular is not depressing, is because, yeah, this is life, and everybody, we have to face it, and yeah, you shouldn't have to turn away. There's something you can do about this. You can. There's a response. It's so that's hopeful.
Mm.
Well, that's coming in a few stanzas.
So
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Yeah.
So this
Okay.
isn't purely a doom and gloom sutta. It actually starts to get a bright side after you get partway through.
But Kumo says death and dying is the backdrop for the Dhamma, isn't it? Suppose there was no death and there was only all other types of suffering. People, we would not care this much to follow the Dhamma, lead spiritual lives. Just a thought that popped up. That's actually a very good point. Have any thoughts, Ajahn Kavila?
There's I think a whole race of people in Gulliver's Travel called the Struldberg. Struldberg people are like Struldbergs, and it's actually an English word which means somebody who's like decrepitly old, and it's like a race of people who just keep getting older and older, and they just never die. So you're totally right. Yeah, Struldberg life sucks. You just get more and more wrinkly, and yet the grape or the tomato hanging down gets more and more kind of like full and wrinkled and saggy.
but actually what comes to mind for me is the Deva worlds. So in the Deva realms where beings live for thousands of years, even millions of years, and because they live so incredibly long, then there's no, and they live very pleasant lives as well as being extremely long. So there's just not much interest in practicing Buddhism. Even the Devas who know the Dhamma don't have much interest in practicing the Dhamma.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you, Bante. Yeah, once again, for me, the backdrop is rebirth. Actually, when I started, for lack of better words, believing in rebirth, my entire experience of seeing the world shifted. Then there was actually a sense of urgency. Death, ironically, didn't give me a sense of urgency. It gave me comfort. My personal death, not the death of others, but my personal death. I was like, okay, it's kind of all right. The suffering will cease eventually. But I might be also weird. Well, actually, most likely, I'm pretty weird. But let's continue. Just as the clay pots produced by a potter all finally end up by breaking, such is the life of mortals. Both the young and the old, both the foolish and the wise, all go under the control of death. All have death as their destination. When those overpowered by death are going from here to the next world, the father cannot protect his son, nor can one protect one's relatives. No. Let's discuss this part.
But the next one is...
All right, they want me to continue. Even as the relatives are looking on and wailing profusely, see how each of the mortals is led away like a cow to be slaughtered. All right, Bante has some thoughts.
Yeah, so we're all gonna die. Yep. So actually, this is one of my favorite mantras. So in Buddhism, there's lots of mantras, and there's really famous ones like Om Mani Padme Hum and so on. But my favorite mantra is, we're all going to die. So actually, every now and then, when I was living in New York City, I used to be riding the subways a lot, getting to and from the places I was teaching meditation. And sometimes I'd be reciting mantras. And so in my mind, I'm going, we're all going to die, we're all going to die. But every now and then I would find myself vocalizing it, like actually saying it out loud. So just imagine this scene, like you're on the subway in New York City and you're depressed and stressed out and anxious, and next to you there's this weird bald guy in a bed sheet saying, we're all gonna die, we're all gonna die, we're all gonna die. The New Yorker in the room says, perfectly normal. You're not a New Yorker.
I am.
You are a New Yorker. Okay. Oh, okay. Which is why you recognize how normal that is for New York City. But yeah, like that's really, the Buddha's just really hammering home this point. Like, not only is death inevitable and something that's going to happen to all of us, but there's actually nothing that we can do to prevent death from coming to other people. And when death comes, then we go alone. You don't bring your relatives and friends with you. You don't bring your possessions with you. You don't bring anything with you except your karma, whatever karma you've generated. But all your friends and relatives and possessions, they can't do anything for you. So that all stays behind.
John, any thoughts?
Yeah, a couple. Well, just in thinking about like different death mantras. I mean, one, my friend Ajahn Kachana had a good one, which is death is certain, time is uncertain. Death is certain, time is uncertain. One which Ajahn Jayasaro just shared with me recently. It came to him in a dream, but I forget the exact situation of the dream. But the mantra was, "Death is coming, ha ha ha." Death is coming, ha ha ha. And I thought that was an awesome mantra because, I mean, the first part is, yeah, it kind of like gets you on edge. You know, you're like, death is coming. God, I got to do something. You know, what am I going to do? But the second part, ha ha ha, it's like, okay, I can settle into this. You know, and there is something I can do. And so yeah, I really appreciated those Ajahn Jaya mantras. With this simile of the clay pots, just as a clay pot produced by a potter, all finally end up by breaking. Such is life of mortals. It reminds me of a very close relative who I visit from time to time collects. It's called like shipwrecked pottery. So shipwrecked porcelain. So this is like, yeah. So when Europeans started being interested in pottery, like porcelain made in China, they would send like these huge ships, which would, come down the coast of the eastern coast of China and then go all the way back to Europe. And but there were lots of times. So this is like starting. I don't know when it was starting, but they got ships, um, you know, which will crash for whatever reason or just sink, but all the cargo, some of it at least is preserved. So there's this whole like market in shipwrecked porcelain of people nowadays who are scuba divers. They would go down and like save this shipwrecked porcelain. So this close relative like collects this porcelain pottery, which is like a teapot which is 400 500 years old. And so that in one aspect that seems to like be pointing that, oh, maybe all clay pots don't necessarily have to break. But I actually proved that wrong. Maybe 5 years ago I went to go visit him, and in the process of setting up my little shrine on his desk, I knocked over one of his like 300-year-old pieces of shipwrecked pottery and like cracked it. And this is like
monk-wrecked pottery.
Yeah, monk-wrecked pottery. He would appreciate that. So yeah, I mean, it's just so true. I mean, even if we don't see these things break, they're gonna break at some point in the future. It's already broken. I think that's an Ajahn Chah quote.
Yeah, and actually following up on that Ajahn Chah quote, I think it's actually so skillful how the Buddha used that metaphor to kind of connect how even with, sort of trivial things, we don't see their nature to break, their nature to decay, their nature to die. So even more so when it comes to like the closer something is to us, to our idea of self, whether it's our own, what we perceive as our own self, or the people that we care about. So whatever is closer to us, the more then we create that delusion that everything is permanent rather than impermanent, rather than seeing the actual nature of the nature to die, the nature to be disintegrated. I also find it very moving, the father cannot protect his son, nor can one protect one's relatives after death. This reminds me of when I was a little girl, actually, and in the village of my mother that we would visit on a regular basis in the summer, there was a child that was the same age of my older brother, and they used to play together all the time. And then at a certain point, he got the flu, and he died. And his mom, actually, still up to this day, like 40 years have gone by, and she's still dressed in black, still going through, so much just distress, wailing profusely, not being capable of coming out that torment, and also that helplessness of not having been able to have helped the child as he was sick, and also afterwards, like that there is that loss, that incredible loss, and the incapability of doing anything about it. So not being able to protect one's life, one's relatives. So in the Metta Sutta, we see how, it's so beautiful how it's described that just as a mother loves their own child. And so I've seen that in my country. We have in Italy, there's a very strong sense of family. So you see really in practice, it's very, very common to see exactly like what the Buddha describes in the Metta Sutta, but also its counterpart. So when the loss happens, then it's experienced in a very dramatic way. So yeah, this is what was coming for me. So we see how, not much has changed in 2,500 years since the Buddha has spoken these verses, that they were relevant in the 80s in Italy, 1980s in Italy, as it was 2,500 years ago in ancient India.
So one more thing on the subject of death mantras, just rewinding a bit. Another one that I really enjoy is Ajahn Brahm's walking meditation. So people normally associate Ajahn Brahm with metta and with jhana practice, but he also talks about death. And one of his walking meditation instructions is, as you walk, you're repeating to yourself, one step closer to death, one step closer to death, one step closer to death. And I find this an incredibly potent way of doing a recollection of death, because there's this physical feeling of moving closer to death with each step. So that's another fun one. So actually, that's a really important thing to keep in mind, by the way, is that recollection of death can be fun. It doesn't need to be horrifying or scary or disturbing. It can actually be an enjoyable activity.
Okay. Until it's not. But thank you for that reminder.
Right. And maybe we could just issue a trigger warning right now, because some people really are. I mean, honestly, some people are triggered by death meditation, and like people who actually are sympathetic to Buddhism, like just for whatever reason they're not like touching this. It's like a third rail for them. It's just like
third rail,
like touch, like on the subway, like maybe the old style subway, you touch this and it like shocks you, and it's
like instant death, like you just avoid it.
Yeah, it's like someone can't approach this subject. They just don't have any angle that they can get into death meditation. So hopefully our talk will get into that. But if you can't, then maybe you might want to just come back to this talk later. But
I mean, realistically, Buddhism is entirely trigger warning. Like everything from the beginning to the end is like one nonstop trigger warning.
Trigger warningism. Or triggerism.
Yeah.
The trigger religion. Anyway, so we'll keep on reading from the verses. Thus the world is stricken by death and by old age. Therefore the wise do not sorrow, having understood the way of the world. You who do not know the path by which he has come or gone, not perceiving either end, yet lament without purpose. If while he's lamenting, bewildered Bewildered person injuring himself could derive some benefit. A wise person too would do the same. It is not by weeping or sorrowing that one attains peace of mind. One's suffering arises still more, and one's body is harmed. One becomes thin and pale, and one inflicts injury upon oneself. The departed are not thereby sustained. Thus, lamentation is useless. Any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. And the Buddha's point here is that lamenting somebody's death is completely pointless. It doesn't do anybody any good. You just make yourself miserable, and it doesn't help the person who passed away. So lamenting somebody's death is, and also you're lamenting something that, again, is completely natural and normal and happens all the time. So it's not denying that one experiences grief, because of course one experiences grief, but rather the Buddha is pointing to the fact that we have a tendency to unnecessarily inflict extra suffering on ourselves, because we don't understand that what's happening is simply a perfectly natural occurrence. Those are my thoughts.
So what you're doing is you're drawing a distinction between like a natural grief versus like the lamentation, which we add to it, which is like unhelpful in a Buddhist context and unnecessary and just compounding dukkha. Because I think I'm just asking because I think the language is probably somewhat significant for some people, like saying that, yeah, the lamentation process is like a fully natural and like healthy, aspect of grieving, someone's passing.
So I think what I should clarify here, that when I said grief just now, what I mean is that like when you've built your life around somebody being present in your life and then that person is suddenly gone, then there's an adjustment process. And so it's not like you just automatically get on with your life, but rather there's a period of time where you're like, oh, wait a minute, that person's not here anymore. And there's some time for you to adjust to the person not being present anymore. So that's what I meant by it being, there's a certain natural adjustment process. But what are we adding on top of that? One thing that I've noticed is that often people have this idea like, oh, I'm supposed to be miserable. I'm supposed to be weeping and wailing all the time. So then they're actually generating sorrow within themselves. They're generating despair within themselves. They're generating anguish. So of course it's natural that there's a certain reaction within your mind when you lose someone that's important to your life. But the question is, are we adding to that unnecessarily? Are we generating suffering unnecessarily? It's never necessary, by the way, to generate suffering.
Well, I would say that there is a distinction also between the state of unenlightenment and the state of enlightenment. So we see that here, actually, the Buddha does not tell us, okay, just stop, with your grief, like stop weeping and wailing. What a waste of time. Like he actually describes the process like in a sort of third person perspective, describing the process first by saying that this is a condition that everybody is experiencing, and the wise do not sorrow to begin with because they've done the work, and they to understand things as they are. So earlier, actually at tea time, we were talking about equanimity. So looking closely, that is what creates equanimity. When we look at something closely, we see it, we understand it. But the further away it is, the more confused we are and the more of the delusion comes up. So that is our current state of existence. We can't even perceive that this is impermanent, that it's subject to decay, subject to break, as we were saying earlier. Of course, I intellectually know that Ajahn Kavilo and Bhante Sudaso could die every single moment, like any moment. Sorry, not every single, well, also every single moment. I guess that's also correct. But any moment they could die. But if they died right now, I would be shocked. because there is only an intellectual understanding of it rather than fully understanding things. So the wise, I'm not wise right now, I'm working on it. But when you're wise, you do not sorrow because you understand things. And to a certain degree, we do understand this process when it doesn't, when it's distant from us. So for example, when fall comes here in the United States, all the leaves start falling and dying out. We don't feel any grief, despair, lamentation. Actually, we also see the beauty. We see the beauty and we see the death. We acknowledge actually the entire experience. We're with the experience. We see it with wisdom. And we understand that it's part of the cycle, that all the trees in the world, they go through exactly the same cycle, right? So there's a wisdom that is innately there. So then we, by understanding that way, we do not sorrow. But when it's close to us, then once again, we don't quite see it. We don't want to see it. And I really appreciate how he's saying, you who do not know the path. And by knowing, it's not just reading about it, but actually knowing, truly knowing as an enlightened being. Actually, it's not the Noble Eightfold Path. Sorry, I think I got it wrong. Do not know the path by which he has come or gone, not perceiving either end, yet lament without purpose, not understanding, I guess, the cycle of samsara, I think, right? Is that
Yeah.
what
Yeah,
he's
talking
referring
about
to?
birth and death.
Yeah.
We don't understand the process of rebirth.
Yeah, we don't understand the process of rebirth, exactly. So then everything is confusing, and the natural response is no different. Actually, this is the flip side of, like, we think we're upset because we don't have, I don't know, pizza. And then we get pizza. We were talking about it the other day. We get pizza and there's that gratification, and then we're happy and we're like, well, clearly it's the pizza that makes me happy. So we want more pizza, and we cultivate that craving, right? We cultivate that greed, thinking that is the solution in order to end suffering. Well, we don't understand that actually the reason why we have the gratification to begin with is because after pizza, we let go of the desire of pizza. So in the same way with grief, then we, like, it's the flip side. Like, we go lamenting, injuring ourselves, like we think that there is some benefit to it. I don't think unnecessarily one wants to do that on purpose, but rather there is that. I definitely have had that experience even recently, that I've experienced grief in a different way. Or when Stan the cat a few months ago was about to die, there was a lot of letting it all out. And there is that exact gratification, no different than having the pizza. It's just that it's in the flip side, if it makes sense. I don't know if my Italian English is is describing things properly. I'm having a bit of difficulty in, because it's fundamentally not understanding that by weeping or sorrowing, one will not get peace of mind. That's not the end of the cessation of suffering. It's not by letting it all out, like going through that experience, that then suffering ceases. But rather, actually, we just keep on indulging in the same pattern, creating the same pattern over and over again, which is actually what I was talking about earlier with the example of that woman, that even after 40 years, she's still undergoing the same extreme suffering. There is no cessation of suffering. So there's a way out that the Buddha tells us. But obviously, we need to create the conditions in order to develop it. So this is what comes to mind for me.
It's interesting, like, in terms of developing those conditions, like, this is one reason why it's good to contemplate death before it's at your doorstep, whether you or the people who you love most, because this medicine, I think, it's too bitter, for someone whose mother just died to say, lamentation is useless. Bemoaning the one who has died, one comes under the control of sorrow. Like, these things, basically, someone could hear this as being like, you shouldn't be sad, which is hard to hear for someone who's sad. All the more if it's the saddest thing that you can imagine. So, like, there's a term, it's like cognitive inoculation, where you're basically like just as like you're getting inoculated, you're getting this
Inoculazione
vaccine.
cognitiva. Okay, yes.
Yeah. So basically, like, if we read this now, if we try to process this now before the disease of our own death and the death of others kind of comes to us, then we'll be more prepared to say, to not fetishize, this sorrowing and grief process, which, many cultures and many kind of ceremonies do. It's it's seen as the thing to do. Like, you're showing respect for the person who died. Like, the longer and the more deeply I experience sadness for this person dying, then the more I'm respecting that person's life. That's a common unstated and maybe even stated, belief for some people. But the Buddha here is very clearly saying that, you don't have to pile more dukkha onto already existent dukkha, and you shouldn't take it as like a badge of merit that your tears are somehow kind of proving that you love somebody. And think about this now before the situation is upon us, because we can think rationally, in now, whereas when the emotions overwhelm us, and just pile onto the shore, then it's harder to hear and practice.
Yeah, I think it's important, actually. Thank you, John, for highlighting that. So that these are not teachings of repression. So it's not that the Buddha is telling us. That's why I was trying to say he's not saying you should, like, you should just suppress all your emotions, but rather he's kind of describing the process in a third person perspective, so that then we understand what is beneficial and what is not beneficial, and create the conditions in order to then be able to practice that way. But it's more like sort of, I read it as kind of diagnosis, so that one has an illness that is already happening and he's describing the illness, rather than like it's not necessarily the cure yet. It's more, this is the illness and this is how it's been mistreated so far, if you know what I mean, if you understand what I mean. Like, fundamentally, like, we're trying to cure cancer with aspirin. So he's describing the process of us being under the delusion of trying to treat cancer by taking pills of aspirin. Well, where clearly there is a different way, but then he's describing how we are going through this process, thinking that that is the only like way to go about our cancer. This is how I take it. Like, it's like a little bit different nuance, which then doesn't mean, obviously, if you're addicted to the aspirin, then you have to create certain conditions in order to remove the addiction to the aspirin and understand how the aspirin is flawed, and then create that sense of urgency to want to then develop the path in order to then have a different treatment go through a different treatment for the cancer and then overcome it altogether. This is how I take it. I don't know if Bhante Sudaso has other. All right, so we can continue. Had I read 585 or not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think 586 is next.
Without abandoning sorrow, a person incurs still more suffering. Bemoaning the one who has died, one comes under the control of sorrow. Behold others, too, about to depart, people who fare according to their karma, living beings just trembling here, having come under the control of death. In whatever way they conceive it, it turns out otherwise. Such a separation. See the way of the world. Even if a person were to live for 100 years or longer, there is separation from one's group of relatives when one abandons life here. Right. Bhante Sudaso, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, he's continuing on a similar point. Also pointing out how people not only do they sorrow the loss of other people, but also they have their own fear of death, that uncertainty of not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing what death is going to bring or what the next life is going to be. Um, and also emphasizing again that there's no way to avoid being separated from one's relatives and loved ones. It's just the inevitability. So one of the five recollections that the Buddha said we should remember every day. One of them is uh, everything that I love is changing and will become separated from me. So it's this constant reminder to ourselves, like no matter what it is that we love, whether it's a person or a possession or an idea or a memory or self-identity, or no matter what it is, it's changing and eventually it's going to be separated from us. So as Ajahn Kovilo was saying, we're inoculating the mind. So by constantly reminding ourselves of this fact, then when things become separated from us, then we won't be disturbed. We're like, oh yeah, I saw that coming. I already knew that was going to happen. Or when things change in dramatic ways, it's like, well, of course, it was never permanent in the first place. So the problem is not that things are changing and becoming separated from us. The problem is that we expect things to be permanent and reliable.
And we have some comments here, actually. So Gita says, this brings to mind the urgency to practice, learn, and travel on the path.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're all on the same page. We all have. It's good that we're going on retreat next week. And Kumu says, first arrow is being sad when someone passes away, and it is natural. The second arrow is the one we can avoid because it creates added sorrow and extreme sad conditions, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's accurate. So you can think of this is a great simile. If people don't know it, it's really helpful for understanding your life, really. But so the Buddha taught the simile of two arrows. So most people are they experience suffering, and then on top of that suffering, on top of the physical suffering, then they add more mental suffering. So the simile for that the Buddha gave was it's like someone's been shot with an arrow, and then they go and kind of stab themselves with an additional arrow, which is unnecessary. And the Buddha said that arhats, they too, it's not like an arhat has no painful feelings, but they don't add that second arrow. So this highlights a distinction between the dukkha of the three characteristics and the dukkha of the Four Noble Truths. So in the three characteristics, you've got impermanence, not self, and dukkha. And what that's pointing to is the universal dukkha, which is in, you could even translate that in, as inconstancy or tension or stress. So this Buddha Rupa is impermanent and it's not self, and it is not stable and enduring and has this stress built into it. That's the meaning of dukkha in the three characteristics. So that's, and our bodies have that. Yeah. So there's dukkha in having a body. The Buddha had a body, and the Buddha experienced physical dukkha of having a body, as have all of us since. But the dukkha of the Four Noble Truths is that which we can do something about. Yeah. So the dukkha of the Four Noble Truths can be transcended. There's a path that leads to the end of it, and that's the second arrow that we don't jab into ourselves. So I think that's a useful distinction. Maybe just to go back, Bhante Sudaso.
Sorry
Oh,
to interrupt. I just had a question actually on this particular question. I have a question on the question because it seems to me that actually the one that described by Kumu, the first arrow is being sad when someone passes away, and it is natural, and the second arrow is the one that we can avoid because it creates added sorrow and extreme sad condition. It seems like something that we could feasibly do before awakening, but I'm inclined to say that an awakened being wouldn't experience sorrow, and it's also what the Buddha says earlier to begin with, because he has understood the process. Therefore, the wise do not sorrow, and the wise is arhats, having understood the way of the world. So I have, like, I think they don't have any dart.
Yeah,
Definitely,
that's correct.
Yeah, they don't have any darts. I mean, the Pali is much more clear. I mean, yeah, Asokan Wirajang Kemon. So like, yeah, arhants have no sorrow. They have no stain. But the English word sorrow is slightly complicated. I mean, there are suttas when Sariputta and Mahamoggallana, die before the Buddha. The Buddha looks out and says, "Oh, this sangha looks, bereft without Sariputta and Moggallana. There's, it's empty, in a sense." And was the Buddha experiencing soka? Was he, mentally suffering from that? No, but I think someone could make a case that even an arhat might experience, yes, some level of, of dukkha,
Well, what?
of the first arrow dukkha, which could be English. I think the sorrow could fall under that as well.
So to use a real life example that I've sometimes used in the past, so there's like sometimes when you're walking down the sidewalk, you get to a point where like there's a big tree growing right next to the sidewalk. So the sidewalk kind of curves around where the tree is. The sidewalk's going straight and it curves around the tree. But then sometimes you get to a point where the sidewalk curves around, but there's not any tree there because the tree already died and was removed, and they removed the stump. So it seems like the sidewalk is just curving around for no apparent reason. So there's this sense like something's wrong here, something's weird, something doesn't feel quite right. So that's more like what I feel like in that story of like the Buddha looking at the Sangha, and he's like, okay, there's no Sariputta and Moggallana, there's something doesn't feel right about this situation. So it's not that the Buddha was experiencing sorrow or any kind of dukkha, but rather he was recognizing that there was something clearly missing. There was something absent. Just like when you come across that sidewalk which curves for no apparent reason, it's because the tree is missing. It's gone, but that the sidewalk is still the way it's always been.
Or just like an acknowledgement, of something not being there anymore, that had a wholesome impact, rather than necessarily being there sort of any bound of attachment. What are your thoughts, Tangang? He's behind the scenes, but tomorrow he will appear on the screen.
I think the first arrow that Tan Kovilo tried to say, that's the body suffering, the pain on the body. That's everybody feel, but we don't add extra pain to it. And as the Buddha story, I think as long as he have the 5 aggregate, the sankhara is still working, but he think, but he don't attach to the thought that he think.
But would you say, what do you think in terms of the sorrow? Like, would an arhat?
They understand it. There's nothing to sorry about.
Great.
There's nothing
All
to be
right.
sorry.
We're all on the same page then.
All on the same page. I think what kind of gets complicated though is like, so like with arhats and Buddhas, yeah, we all agree they don't feel sorry about anything. There's no soka for them. But say like, for us, like one application of this 2-dart simile, I think of is like past karma as being like the first dart. So like, my brother dies, and the initial response, because I'm not yet an arhat, is sorrow. That's like, that's a past, a result from past actions in the past. I'd experience, attachment to my brother, and in the present, before I've done any present moment karma of like adding to that sorrow, this thing comes from the past. I'm sad. My brother just died. So that's one way of thinking of this 2-arrow simile. And then the second arrow in this way is like, I see that sorrow and I don't fuel it. I don't add more sorrow on top of it.
Yeah, which is, why I was saying that. what Kumo is suggesting is something that actually seems very feasible that we can do at an early stage of practice that is achievable. But then with arahatship, we can actually remove the issue altogether. But that's also because we have created conditions as we're practicing to have different results. That is very important. Thank you, John, for highlighting that. One of my favorite quotes from Venerable Drime, Tibetan Bhikkhuni, is we cannot control the consequences, but we can control the causes. So then in every moment, we can plant new seeds. So then that will have different results than the ones that we're currently experiencing. So sorrow is because we've planted seeds to create that result in the past. And I think that's also, part of faring according to their karma. Well, here the Buddha is talking about it in terms of, rebirth, but it's fundamentally our experience. So we're basically being reborn every moment. And Rick is saying, when I was a child, I was inspired to practice this path by monks who embodied the fruits of the practice. As suffering increased as I got older, I gave myself wholeheartedly to this way of life. I have found that the intensity of my suffering is equal to how much I resist accepting the loss.
Yeah.
Any comments?
Yeah, actually, one of the things Bhante Rahula likes to say is he says, suffering equals pain times resistance. So he says, this is the equation of dukkha. Suffering equals pain times resistance.
And Joy follows up on that, saying we actually see our own strong attachments when someone close to us dies. Yes, also when we're experiencing, perhaps it's a relationship, so we break up, or a friendship, and the friendship ceases to exist. Anything that we are actually attached to, then the pain is directly proportional. Charles Lee says, the second arrow also distracts me from properly dealing with the first arrow.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's also what the Buddha is pointing to here, is that when we keep piling more dukkha on top of our dukkha, then that also just makes us more and more confused and bewildered. So it makes it even harder to deal with our struggles. So we want to catch the process as early as possible. And recognize what we're experiencing and what we're going through. So this is also where mindfulness of emotion becomes really important. So as Ayyā Somā was saying earlier, Buddhism is not a path of repression. It's not a path of repressing our emotions or ignoring our emotions. Actually, we need to be fully and clearly aware. So that if we do see sorrow starting to arise, we should be aware, oh, that's sorrow arising. I need to be really careful that I don't start heaping more dukkha on my mind, because that's just going to make me even more confused and make me suffer even more.
That's a good question for the Venerables. So this quote at 588, which we talked about before we gave the talk, in whatever way they conceive it, it turns out otherwise. Another translation is more present tense of, in whatever way one conceives it, the truth is ever otherwise.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating principle just to reflect on, and can, is a good antidote for. I've usually thought about it as like detaching from views, or like basically it's a great cure for any kind of attachment, especially if there's like any anger arising. Okay, whatever way I conceive it, the truth is ever otherwise. I think that I know what's going on, but the truth is ever otherwise. Whatever way I am making up this story, the truth is ever otherwise. But what is the context? And so that quote appears a number of times in the canon.
Yeah,
what does it mean here?
Well, in other contexts, it's actually much more clear. So here, as you pointed out, it's translated as though it's future tense, but the Pali is actually present tense. So it properly it should say, in whatever way they conceive it, it is otherwise, not it turns out otherwise. Just hoti is present tense. It is otherwise. So I think he's pointing here, if you look just right before that, he's talking about people dying. So he's talking about how people have concepts about what they think dying is. But the Buddha is saying the reality is always different from our concepts. So whatever you think death is, that's not it.
So it doesn't make sense to sorrow because you don't even know what you're sorrowing about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, also he's talking about them, right? Like the people who are. So they is referred to the people who are.
Coming under the control of death.
Yeah, coming under the control of death.
Yeah, people about to depart.
So the people who are dying, right? Not the people who are waiting. I mean, who are assisting, or who are staying here. So it's the person who is actually in the process of dying. Yeah, and I guess it's that connection also with between ignorance and suffering. So whenever we don't know something, then we just create a lot of delusion that leads us to suffering. But the more we know something, then the suffering sort of fades away.
Mm.
But I find it very interesting. I hadn't thought about that in terms of going, okay, well, it's other than what I'm expecting it to be, and then releasing the suffering from that point of view. Like to me, it's more like, well, since I don't know, maybe I should just let go of not like letting go of really wanting to know, why this loss is happening or why this death is happening.
Well, I think here the point is more, again, for someone who's actually entering into the dying process to drop all of our concepts and opinions and ideas about what dying is going to be like, but just to go into it with a mind of curiosity, just like really paying attention. It's like, well, I actually have no idea what this is. I don't know. Most people don't remember the last time they died. So we're going into it as though it was a fresh experience, even though we've done this millions of times. But we're going into it as though it was new. So let's go into it with a mind of curiosity. So recognizing that whatever concepts we have are not relevant, but rather we should be completely open to and curious about the actual experience that's happening. At least that's the feeling I'm getting from reading this at this time.
It's interesting. I guess maybe because I am kind of extending the meaning to any type of death and loss. So not only like the sort of traditional death, but also the death of a relationship, as I was saying earlier, or the death of a friendship, or the death of, like a sort of stage in one's life. And when it's perhaps sudden, for example, it can be very disorienting. And if the person, say, stops talking to you, for example, you have no idea. So the mind can start creating so many reasons and stories on why this happened the way it happened and what is going on in the person's mind, etc. And that can create a lot of suffering and torment and desperation and wailing and lamentation, like not terribly different than when we are experiencing, death of loved ones, or when we are experiencing the death of ourselves. In a way, actually, we are dying. A part of us is dying in that process too. That relationship, which was, we kind of feel a kind of limb of ourselves, at least maybe I'm Italian, so like we have more intense experience. I'm not sure. I'm surrounded by two Americans, Anglo-Saxon descent, so they are a little bit less emotional perhaps. Not sure. But I was thinking, that process of not knowing really creates dukkha, but it is so true that in whatever way they conceive it, it's probably, even though you think you've gone from A to Z, all the possible scenarios, in reality, it's actually a different alphabet. It was Cyrillic. It was not the Roman alphabet type of thing. It's a different. It turns out to be otherwise. So then my way of dealing with that situation, after all the things that didn't work, it was just like, okay, I'll just let go from wanting to desperately like figure out an hypothesis, and then you're just actually present with the loss. So you're looking closely at the loss, and you're looking at the experience of loss without creating any fabrications. And that relieves the suffering, as well as forgiving yourself and forgiving the other. But maybe, it's a bit of a tangent.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and read the rest of the sutta so that we get
Oh,
through the
yes,
whole thing before we
48.
run out of time.
Therefore, having heard it from the Arhat, one should stop lamentation. Having seen that he has departed and died, realize, I cannot bring the dead back to life. Just as if one's shelter were blazing, one would extinguish the fire with water. So too a sensible person, wise, learned, skilled, would quickly blow away arisen sorrow as the wind does a tuft of cotton wool. Blow away lamentation and muttering and one's own dejection. Seeking happiness for oneself, one should draw out the dart from oneself. With the dart drawn out, unattached, having attained peace of mind, having overcome all sorrow, sorrowless, one is quenched. I find it very interesting that he's just, talking about one dart. Any thoughts? Honorables?
Yeah, so it's interesting here that he's talking about sorrow as being like when your house catches fire. So when your house catches fire, you make an immediate effort to put out the fire. You don't just sit there and watch it burn, and you definitely don't add more fire, but rather you immediately try to put it out. So it's interesting here. He's saying that actually, if we notice that we're getting into the old sorrowing activity, that we should take it as a matter of vital concern, like just as immediate as if your house catches fire. We should immediately try to stop fueling the sorrow.
Yeah, I appreciate highlighting that metaphor. And then in that same stanza, he says, so too a sensible person who's learned and skilled would quickly blow away arisen sorrow as the wind does a tuft of cotton wool. I mean, that's fascinating because it's just so easy to blow away like just a tuft. Like, it's gone. And that's kind of fascinating. I mean,
it's easy to blow away a tuft of cotton, but if you keep heaping and piling it together and weaving fabric out of it, and you've got this giant bolt of cloth, well, you can't just blow that away with a puff of breath. So I think that's also pointing to the fact that if you catch an emotional process early, then it's much easier to deal with it than if you wait until you've already built it up into something monstrous.
So I think it's very important to also highlight how a sensible person, wise, learned, and skilled, so that someone has already put, once again, these conditions in place, then they can actually do this. So not to feel too bad about ourselves, like that we are, we're not being capable of blowing away a risen sorrow, like the wind does a tuft of cotton wool. We're just, perhaps we have a bit of wisdom, we are a bit learned, we are a little bit skilled, we are a little bit sensible as we're going about the path, but we're not fully there. So obviously there is going to be, it's predictable that we're going to experience sorrow and lamentation, and it's not going to be as easy as just contemplating these words and letting it all go.
Yeah, I mean, as Ajahn Chah said, much of Buddhist practice is knowing what we should do and not being able to do it.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And Ajahn, you want to say?
Oh, just on that same subject, I mean, extending the metaphor as you were doing, or most of us, we find ourselves with a big, huge heap of big bolt of cotton, or our house is just, it's we've only got one small little corner of the house that's left, and the rest is on fire. But the Buddha doesn't say. The Buddha still says, like, one should extinguish it. You should still try to extinguish it. You've still got something left. You shouldn't just let it, burn down even the last vestige of house that you've got left. Don't let it set fire to the surrounding houses or your property. And I mean, we just have to work where we're at. Our fire is like taking up different degrees of our house, and we just have to work and to try to extinguish wherever it's at, and to be patient and do it with metta, and not hate ourselves because our fire is more emblazoned than
Yeah.
not.
And as Master Seng Yan actually said, Master Seng Yan was a famous Chinese Zen master, the founder of the Dharma drum lineage in Taiwan. He said, in order to learn how to swim, we need to get into the water. So I think this is very apt, like in terms of that, yeah, even though we only have a little glass of water and the fire is actually all over the building, we still need to, we just learn how to cool off the water, the fire with whatever we have there that is capable. And as we learn how to extinguish this small little fire and so everything else is ablaze, then we actually develop the skill set to then increase the water, build the water, and learn how to do it. And then we're ready to actually, well, not set the building on fire to begin with.
Yeah, that helps.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're running a bit low on time. Are there any other questions or
Yes,
comments here?
there are. Well, Yudi, good to see you. Yudi says we need to eat muffins and cookies. Well, if they're offered, sure. And Anita says, Venerables, what words of compassion do the sutta provide towards families who are grieving? Is there a sutta to this effect? Ajahn Kamil, can you think of anything?
I mean, yeah, that's one trouble with like reading a sutta out like this, like to a big, who knows how many people will listen to this. But basically, like, I mean, the Buddha's advice, if someone can hear it, is worth hearing. Don't add more suffering to. Really, it's hard. Every situation is different, and oftentimes they might not be in a place to hear anything. So if you can just be with that person, that might be the best you can do. And if you're someone who's already drenched in Dhamma, steeped in Dhamma, then maybe after that mood has passed in that person and they've seen that you care about them, then they might be open to hearing something else.
Well, one thing that the Buddha does offer for grieving people is to do something good in memory of the person. So in dedicating a good act, so performing some act of charity or goodness in the world in the name of the person who's passed away, and wishing may the goodness of this act be to their benefit. So this is a way of doing something joyful and wholesome and meritorious, and starting to build up positive feelings, wholesome feelings related to the person who's passed away. So actually wishing for them to be happy, healthy, and safe in their next life. Imagining them wherever they are, looking at your goodness and rejoicing in your goodness as you're doing your good deeds. So you can start to build up a different attitude. Instead of just lamenting about how sad you are that you lost that person, instead you're wishing, may that person be happy and healthy, may they always have good conditions and supportive conditions. And if they do remember back to me, may they see me doing good deeds in their honor, in their memory, and in dedication to them. So that brings a joyful tone when you think about the person, rather than just weeping and wailing all the time. And also it does actually help the person in their next life, so everybody wins.
Yeah, and actually in 585, the verse, the Buddha says, in fact, the departed are not thereby sustained, thus lamentation is useless. So by the lamentation, wailing, and despair that we undergo, we're actually not benefiting the dead. The dead.
Yeah.
But as Bhante Sudaso said, there are actually more skillful ways to benefit, ourselves and others.
Yeah.
And Rick says, there seems to be a challenge in the West to facing suffering and death. When people believe in only living one life, that can seem to be the way to end suffering, whereas rebirth inspires practice. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That was definitely, I think, my attitude prior to Buddhism. And Piyal says, there are three types of dukkha: dukkha due to bodily pain, dukkha due to change, dukkha due to sankhara, or sankhara dukkha due to clinging. However, does all dukkha boil down to the last, the dukkha due to clinging to volitional formations?
I think that's a little off topic, so maybe save that one for monk chat. That's actually a great monk chat question.
Right. And Gita says, Bhante Bali tells us in class to meditation on death like a dress rehearsal for a play to prepare our mind for the actual event. Oh, to prepare our mind. Yeah, Venerable Body is wonderful. I'm glad that you have the opportunity to learn from him. Oh, hello, Tora. Good to see you online. And Brian says, good to remind ourselves that happiness is the end goal too. So many teachings on emptiness, equanimity, non-attachment to positive, negative, neutral can make us lose sight that happiness is the goal.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Happiness is, comes with the end of suffering. Unconditional happiness comes with the end of suffering. So yeah, absolutely. That's what we're doing here. But we need to understand suffering in order to get any happiness. Excellent topic. Okay, I think actually that's the last question. And it's 8:58. Any last thoughts from the Venerable?
We're all gonna die.
Yeah, that is for sure.
But we also all have the capacity to attain awakening. So let's make the effort.
Yeah, and so much gratitude for the Buddha to really lay out the path for us to practice, to follow, and to develop the conditions for the cessation of suffering. Because this is basically the main difference that has happened personally in my life. I remember exactly the state of my mind when I experienced for the first time the loss of someone really dear to me when I was 10 years old. And then also when I was 15, my grandmother and several others afterwards. So it's been this kind of lots of suffering, and that not seeing any end in sight, not seeing any way out of suffering. That is the most suffering that one can experience. But the Buddha not only tells us that there is an end to this, also gives us a path. And we don't have to wait until the end of the path. We can see it step by step as we're practicing, how our mind is cooling off, how actually just even having just a cup of water to cool the fire makes a huge difference than having no relief, no cooling opportunity. All right, so thank you all for joining us this evening. We'll be meeting again tomorrow at 8 a.m. New York City time with Sutta study, I think from Bhante Sudhasar or Ajahn Kabilo.
I don't know.
Surprise, one of them. And then in the evening, you can bring all your questions for monk chat. And Ajahn Kabilo, unfortunately, will not be with us anymore. It's been delightful having you here, Ajahn. Thank you so much for coming to Empty Cloud and sharing the Dhamma. But we will have another wonderful friend, Tangang, who will be here and answering some questions. Hopefully. We haven't actually asked him. We just assumed. He said, okay, great. All right, so we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.